So here's what we're going to do to start off. I'm going to give you some descriptions of movie endings, but horribly explained. Okay, this is sort of adapted from a BuzzFeed article, if you remember BuzzFeed. And I'm going to ask you to guess what the movie is. Okay, so for the first slide. After 9 hours, they finally returned the jewelry. So that's the ending of a movie. What is the movie? Any guesses? What was it? Titanic? Not Titanic. Oh, that's a good one. Not Titanic. It wasn't 9 hours, though. Nobody? Okay, so next slide. It's Lord of the Rings, right? So it was actually more than 9 hours, right? It was, who knows, 12 hours if you do the extended version. Okay, next. So this is an old one. So the family's first Airbnb experience went very wrong. And this actually existed before Airbnb, but it's the same idea. Maybe I made these too hard. Okay, so this one is referring to The Shining. Okay, so if you remember, they had to watch the hotel and everything went horribly wrong. Some of you are like, what the heck is The Shining? Sorry. Okay, this one is, I'll give you a hint. This is Disney. She ended up marrying her kidnapper. Beauty and the Beast. Okay, so I guess we need a little bit of that. Okay, this one's a little bit more recent. And he finally woke up from a deep series of naps. Series of naps is the key. Not The Matrix, but good. Close. I made this too hard. Inception, yeah, right? So Inception was dreams within dreams within dreams. Last one. After reuniting with his son, he couldn't convince him to take over the family business. This is a sequel. Oh, do I not have that, Jeff? Okay, sorry. So let me say it again. Since we don't have that, we can just blank screen. After reuniting with his son, he couldn't convince him to take over the family business. It's a sequel. Sci-fi nerds will know this. Empire Strikes Back, right? Empire Strikes Back, right? So if you don't know, too bad. Okay, so the reason I bring this up is to take you through how we ended up here, just kind of in the mind of the person who's been the main teaching person at this church, is when we sort of transitioned, we were in the middle of the book of Hebrews. And after Hebrews, I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to speak on. But the theme of the whole 5 or 6 years was this idea of going through the letters that were written to the churches to understand what it is, what are the truths that churches need to understand in order to last, right? The whole series is called Built to Last. So after Hebrews, I'm like, what do we do? So the next letter that we hadn't gone through was Revelation. So I decided to go to Revelation. And then if you remember last year, I kind of stopped right before we got to the end of the Revelation because I realized, wait. We're about to end the story, but we don't know the problem. It's like me giving you the ending, right? And so exactly what we just did. I gave you the ending, but we don't know the full story. And actually, we don't understand the problem. And so that's what led me to say, let's stop. Let's not look at the ending. Let's actually understand the problem. And so the problem that Revelation is trying to resolve goes all the way back to Genesis. So we went all the way back to Genesis, and the problem was laid out very clearly in Genesis 3, and it's this problem of sin. Okay? And this problem of sin was developed a little bit further, actually, in the writings of Paul. So in Romans 7, here's what Paul talks about sin. Now, if I do what I do not want, I agree with the law, that it is good. So now it is no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells in me. For I know that nothing good dwells in me, that is, in my flesh. For I have the desire to do what is right, but not the ability to carry it out. For I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want is what I keep on doing. Now, if I do what I want, it is no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells in me. 2 weeks ago, when I talked about the story of Cain, I characterized sin, or the way sin was characterized in the Bible, was as this external force, this animal that says it's waiting, right? It stands at the door, and it's waiting to devour you or to rule over you. But what Paul is saying is the problem is actually much worse, is that sin is not this external force that's influencing us. It's actually dwelling in us. So sin is part of what's in us, right? God's Spirit is meant to dwell in us, but what's actually dwelling in us is sin. And Romans 3 says it this way: there is no distinction, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. So when I first read this verse as a kid, I really struggled. What does that mean, that we fall short of the glory of God? And the way it's usually explained is God is perfect and we're not, and we fall short of that, and so we don't get to be with God. But another way to frame what this verse is talking about in light of what we've been doing this past year is because of sin, we are unable to reflect into the world how glorious our God is. The whole first parts of Genesis lays out this truth that we were supposed to be his images. We were supposed to show the world and all of creation what God is like. We were supposed to express to the rest of creation what God's love is like. But instead, we can't do that. We can't show the world what the image of God is like because we end up imaging something else because of the sin that dwells within us. We were meant to, with God's mentorship, take creation forward, but because it wasn't God dwelling in us, because we were influenced by sin, we ended up polluting creation, and we can't help it. That's the problem. So it's not just that sin makes us do bad things, it's that sin inhibits us from fulfilling our purpose of showing the glory of God to the rest of creation, and we end up ruining the project that he handed over for us to take into flourishing, and we can't do anything about it. But where there was a problem, where the problem occurred right away, God brings hope, because here's what it says in Genesis chapter 3. So the serpent deceived Eve, right? In verse 14, the Lord said to the serpent, because you have done this, cursed are you above all livestock and above all beasts of the field. On your belly you shall go, and dust you shall eat all the days of your life. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. Here it is. He, who's the he? Right? It's not the woman. It's someone else from the woman. He, the offspring of the woman, shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. So from the very beginning, this problem comes, and God says, here's going to be the solution. There's going to be an offspring that comes out of this woman, or some verses, some translations say seed, and they're going to bruise your head. That word in Hebrew, that phrase, just means there's going to be this fatal blow. They're going to crush your head and end your influence over my creation. That was the problem. That was the problem with sin. The solution was someone's going to come, an offspring of the woman, who's going to crush you. Okay, are you with me? So here's what I want us to do for the next 10 minutes. I want us to put ourselves in the situation, in the shoes of an Israelite living before the time of Jesus. And if you're an Israelite living before the time of Jesus, you're watching the world that God meant for flourishing and for order falling apart instead into decay and chaos. You've watched your nation of Israel fail to follow God and instead follow idols. And what makes it worse is you've watched other nations that aren't following God, and they're thriving. And they're defeating you. And they're growing rich and wealthy and comfortable. This is the world you live in, right? And the time that you live in the promised land is not peaceful. God promised that when he gives you this land, it will be a land of peace, but it's not peaceful. There's always this anxiety because you're always worried about other nations invading you, and you're worried that your leaders are actually going to lead you away from following God. There's no peace. There's no justice. There's no righteousness. Everything is decaying into chaos. That's true today, right? And what you know, and we talked about 2 weeks ago, is this is not just a human fleshly thing. It is influenced by spiritual forces, the serpent. And you go back to this verse that you have heard from childhood, repeated again and again, that yes, we're living in a time where there is no peace. Yes, you're living in a time where enemies are conquering us, but there's going to come an offspring. There's going to come a seed that's going to crush not just the nations that are battling against us, but is going to crush the very spiritual forces that are trying to destroy us. But the problem is, this hasn't happened. And in fact, the first human after chapter 3, after Adam and Eve, the first human, Cain, when given a choice, when God said, if you do good, you're going to be like my offspring, but if you do bad, you're going to be the offspring of the serpent. The first human, after this promise, chose to be an image and a reflection and an offspring of the serpent. It's kind of hopeless. But in your history, there have been moments where you felt like this is the one. This person that God has brought to us, this is the offspring that's been promised. Remember David? They must have thought David was the one. Because if you remember, the way we characterized Goliath 2 weeks ago was like a serpent. And what part, let me think back, okay? What part of Goliath's body was crushed, figuratively? His head, right? So I'm an Israelite and I'm reading this. There's this serpent. Goliath looked like a serpent, but there's an offspring that's going to crush his head. Goliath's head was crushed. It must be David, but it wasn't. So what do you think? You think maybe it's Solomon. At least Solomon built the temple. We've been trying for generations to build this temple. God has been living in this tent because we haven't had a home. We haven't had the resources. We haven't had the riches. We haven't been able to build this temple. We haven't had peace. It must be Solomon because Solomon is the one that is finally going to build the temple. But it wasn't Solomon. And generation after generation, what you see is the kings that people have appointed, the kings that God has put in the throne, they follow God, and it looks like they're going to bring this kingdom. It looks like they're going to bring this victory, and then the next king pulls your nation away from following God and into idolatry, and everything falls apart again. And so there's just this whole cycle in your relationship with this promise. There's this whole cycle of hope and disappointment, hope and disappointment, hope and disappointment. Situations where it seems like God is finally going to fulfill that promise. And here's the person he's going to do it through. And then the next thing you know, everything falls apart. And that promise is not fulfilled. God's finally going to answer our prayer. And then everything falls apart. That's you as an Israelite. That's your whole history. Yes, there's hope. Oh, this disappointment. And maybe we are in seasons like that or have had seasons like that where we really have to convince ourselves to stay faithful because if we were to be honest, what we experience is hope and disappointment, hope and disappointment, hope and disappointment. Right? God's about to come through, but then he doesn't. God's about to fix this problem that's been going on in our life for years, and it feels like it's improving, and then it doesn't. Things seem to be getting better, and then something comes along and destroys the trajectory of peace that you were experiencing for a short time. God's about to answer prayers, and then he doesn't. Hope and disappointment. That is your entire existence as an Israelite in relation to trying to believe the promise that an offspring is going to come to crush everything the serpent had done. It wasn't David. It wasn't Solomon. But the prophets come around and it becomes a little bit clearer how God's plan is going to be lived out. So in Jeremiah chapter 23 it says, "Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will raise up for David a righteous branch, and he shall reign as king and deal wisely and shall execute justice and righteousness in the land." You hear that, you're like, yes, we need justice, we need righteousness. All I see is injustice, right? The evil people are getting richer. We need these things. In these days, Judah will be saved and Israel will dwell securely. And this is the name by which he will be called. The Lord is our righteousness. Therefore, behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when they shall no longer say, as the Lord lives, who brought up the people of Israel out of Egypt, but as the Lord lives, who brought up and led the offspring of the house of Israel out of the north country and out of all the countries where he had driven them. Then they shall dwell in their own land. And you as an Israelite are like, that's all I want to do. I just want peace. I just want a place to call home. I just want to be able to settle. I just want righteousness and justice. And what Jeremiah is telling us and reminding us, it's going to happen, but it's going to happen through the lineage, through the family of David. So this offspring becomes connected with the house of David and the sons and grandsons and other ancestors of David on the throne. But here is what they didn't realize, and here's actually a situation that we didn't realize is how bad that got. And the reason we don't realize it is because there's a story that I know I didn't think about. And I just kind of read over. But actually, so much family drama happened in this time that the promise of God almost didn't come true. And it happens around the time of Jehoshaphat. And the reason why I think we didn't think about it, I didn't think about it, is some of the people that I'm about to talk about are not even mentioned in the genealogies in Matthew chapter 1. Did you know the genealogies in Matthew chapter 1 are not comprehensive? Right? Some generations were left out to make a theological point. Let's not get into that. But what I'm about to talk about isn't even mentioned in the genealogy. Okay? So here we go. Here is where the promise seemed like it was done, and it wasn't going to happen. 2 Chronicles, chapter 21. Jehoshaphat slept with his fathers and was buried with his fathers in the city of David, and Jehoram his son reigned in his place. He had brothers, the sons of Jehoshaphat. So it names all these brothers that I'm not going to try to pronounce. Verse 3, their father gave them great gifts of silver, gold, and valuable possessions, together with fortified cities in Judah. But he gave the kingdom to Jehoram because he was the firstborn. When Jehoram had ascended to the throne of his father and was established, he killed all his brothers with the sword, and also some of the princes of Israel. Jehoram was 32 years old when he became king, and he reigned 8 years in Jerusalem. Can we go back to the family tree? So what happened? Jehoshaphat gave the kingdom to his son, Jehoram, and he wiped out all of his brothers. So how many are left in the line of David to fulfill the promise as spoken in Jeremiah? 1. Jehoram. And he just killed his brothers. That's a little bit of a situation. So let's stay here because it gets worse, as if it couldn't get worse. So Jehoram ends up marrying this queen named Athaliah. We don't really know who she is. Some say she's the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel, which is very evil people in the Bible. But the point is, Athaliah was not necessarily part of the David line, okay? So Jehoram marries this woman, and his reign was characterized by 2 things. One was a revolt, and one was actually a raid by the Philistines, who killed everyone. So the Philistines came in, and they killed everyone except for his youngest son, Azahiah. Is everyone staying with me? This is really complicated. Okay? So now how many are left in the line of David to fulfill the promise? 1. The one son that was spared. Okay? But then it gets worse, because that one son, Azahiah, was killed. If you read about it, a guy named Jehu killed him and his extended family. So he still had sons, but a lot of his extended families were killed. And so what his mother, right, Athaliah, the one in red there, when she heard of his death, she got mad. And so what she did is she took the throne and killed all his sons, her grandsons. She killed all her grandsons and his relatives. So Azahiah died, and all of Azahiah's sons died. How many are left to fulfill the prophecy that the offspring is going to come through the line of David? If you're an Israelite, 0. None. She killed them all. She killed her grandkids. And she killed all the other relatives. 0. So if you're an Israelite and you know the promise is supposed to come through the line of David, what do you face? Disappointment. There was hope, because Jehoshaphat was actually a good king. The next one was not. Hope and disappointment. Hope and disappointment. When you see this, when you see that this event happened, what are you thinking? You're thinking it's over. We've lost. It's like that scene in the movie where the heroes have tried to do everything they can, and you feel like they have a chance, and then nope, they lost. We thought there was a chance. We lived in hope. We still lost. Try as we did, we still lost. The miracle did not happen. The underdog did not win. So as I was kind of reflecting on this, an incident at church a few weeks ago actually reminded me of this. And here at this church, after service, we watched Game 7 of the World Series, and many of us were here. And that game was really bittersweet because on one hand, I'm glad my team won. But on the other hand, if we could have put up the slides, I want you to see the faces of the team that lost, the fans of the team that lost, the Blue Jay fans. And the reason why it was so heartbreaking is they were 2 outs away from winning their first championship since 1993. 2 outs. They were so close. What were they feeling? Hope. This is it. This is what we've been waiting for. We're not favored. We're like David. The Dodgers are like Goliath, but we're going to win. We're 2 outs away. And then what happened? The Dodgers tied it. Disappointment. Then there were so many chances for them to win in the 9th and the 10th. Hope. But then what ended up happening? Disappointment. And I was pretty affected by a lot of the scenes they showed of crying children and shocked adults. And I just kind of look at this, multiply this by 1,000. That's what an Israelite must have felt when they're like, the kings that come through David, someone's going to come that's going to rescue us. And then what happens? All of them died. It's over. We lost. It's Infinity War instead of Endgame. We lost. So many movie references today, right? I don't even really like movies that much. But we know it wasn't over. So what happened? Here's what happened. 2 Kings, chapter 11, verse 1 through 3. Now when Athaliah, that's the grandmother, right? The mother of Ahaziah saw that her son was dead, she arose and destroyed all the royal family. Look at verse 2. But Jehosheba, the daughter of King Joram, sister of Ahaziah, took Joash, the son of Ahaziah, and stole him away from among the king's sons who were being put to death, and she put him and his nurse in a bedroom. Thus they hid him from Athaliah, so that he was not put to death, and he remained with her 6 years, hidden in the house of the Lord, while Athaliah reigned over the land. Can we put up the family tree again? Joash. Isn't that crazy? When it seemed like it's over, all of Ahaziah's sons were killed by their grandmother, what happened? God had a plan. God preserved a remnant, Joash. And Joash took the throne. And eventually, if you read the genealogies in Matthew 1, I think it goes Jehoshaphat, Jehoram, and then it skips Joash for some reason, and then it goes straight to Uzziah, but we're back on track. Isn't that crazy? Right? God was never going to fail in his promises, even though it seemed like it at the time. It seemed like the game was over. God was never going to fail in his promise, ever. So my goal for today, my heart for today is just to understand a little bit more of how God moves in history and how God moves in our story, and it's one of faithfulness. That when God says so, it's going to happen. That God's promises are yes and amen. That sometimes from our point of view, it feels like it's over, we're done. Prayers are not answered. Life is not going to get any better. We have failed. We fought, but we lost. We tried, but it didn't matter because God did not come through. But our God is faithful. Our God has a plan. And that plan does not make sense to us because I would not have done it this way. Because it feels like, God's promises are just hanging on by this thread. There's this just one person left in David's line, one person's left in David's line, and then, God, you were not careful enough because now there's none. And it feels like God's plan is hanging by a thread. And it feels like hope is fading. Are we going through that? That maybe we still have hope, but like Israel, the hope sort of dies a little bit every generation because every generation sees nothing's happening, or every generation sees that it goes back and forth, or every generation that has hoped has been disappointed. Maybe we still have hope, but a little bit less hope than the previous day because life has now kind of beaten us up and given us a reality check. And that reality check says, God's not going to answer. God's not going to be faithful. But if we understand anything about what we're celebrating during this Advent season, it's that God doesn't move the way we expect him to. God's not going to answer our prayers packaged in a way we expect him to. And it's going to seem at times where God is not going to answer that prayer or fulfill that promise. And in human eyes, it seems like it's over and we've failed. But I want us to remember that our God is faithful to fulfill his promise. But it doesn't always happen the way we expect. Right? One of the most tragic verses for me is John chapter 7. Here's what it says. They heard these words. Some of the people said, "This really is the prophet." Others said, "This is the Christ." But some said, "Is the Christ come from Galilee? Has not the scripture said that the Christ comes from the offspring of David and comes from Bethlehem, the village where David was?" So there was a division among the people over him. Some of them wanted to arrest him, but no one laid hands on him. This is so sad because here, the fulfillment of generation after generation's hopes was right in front of them. The offspring they've been waiting for since Genesis 3 was right in front of them. The promise had finally been fulfilled, but it didn't come in an expected way. It didn't happen at the expected time, and people missed it. The very answer to your prayers and your hopes is right in front of you, and yet there's division. Some saw it, some didn't. Why? Because even though our God is faithful, he does not answer prayers the way we always want him to answer prayers. And I'm sure even those that believed, when they saw him on that cross, what did they feel? We lost again. We put our faith. I had hope that he was the one. He's on that cross. We lost again. It's just the cycle of our people. Hope and disappointment. Hope and disappointment. But little did they know that that was just the beginning. And that God's promise was fulfilled on that cross. So Pearl Church, today, I don't really have a point. But today I hope that if you were able to put yourself in the shoes of an Israelite who had seen the history of their nation not go very well, and in fact face moments in their history where it felt like God had failed, that we would just remember that whatever we're going through, whatever season it may feel like God is not caring, or God is not answering, God is not listening, or that God is not powerful enough to solve our situation, that our God is always faithful to his promises. So today, as we take some time to just share, here's the things I just want us to kind of think about, right? How do we deal with these cycles of hope and disappointment? I'm sure there's times where you felt like God's finally going to heal this, or God's finally going to change this person, God's finally going to have this breakthrough. And there's hope. It doesn't happen, just disappointment. How do we deal with that? Or are there times, like in this story of Jehoshaphat's ancestors, David's ancestors, where it felt like that hope is just hanging by a thread? And you question whether God is powerful enough to really see through the promises, or God is powerful enough to answer some of those prayers. But also, just like the people in John, are there ways where we might be missing how God is working in our life because it doesn't look the way we expect? It's not smooth. It's not easy. It doesn't feel good. It's not pleasant, but God is working. So let's just take a moment to reflect, and then I'll pray, and then we'll share.